The following is a recording of a real poker coaching session. To find out more about available coaching packages and courses, head to pokerfluency.com today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the video. First of all, let's tackle the question that you had about that particular flop that you were studying. You were studying that 10-7-6 flop. So talk me through what the sort of point of confusion might have been there about why you were seeing a big bet come in.
With thinking the big blind, and maybe I'm wrong in thinking the big blind will have 9-8 offsuit, but I feel like they would have 9-8 offsuit. We wouldn't. That gives them a lot more straights. We'll have the 9-8 suiteds, but just that fact, and then their propensity also to maybe have some, I guess we can have 10-7 suited as well, but I think they'd have 10-6 suited. Just, we both share that. It just didn't strike me as like it was connected. Just a little too connected for me to think large bet.
Okay. All of that is very logical. I think the main sort of missing link would be to maybe think a bit less specifically about the actual nuts and more about the sort of overall region of hands that is happy to play a big pot there. So let me show you what I mean. I've got it pulled up on Octopi right here. I'll just load it for you. So this is the sim for that 10-7-6 flop. You see that coming through?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. This is the side-by-side view here. And if you pay attention to the hand classes, you can see that if we were to say, for example, that every overpair plus is the category of hand that would be willing to play a fairly big pot here on the 10-7-6, then if we categorize those hands for this particular spot, villain has no overpairs, first of all, which is definitely relevant here. And villain has 2% straights, 1% sets, and 2% two pairs. So in general here, the region of hands that can stack off for them is only about 5% of hands, right? 5% of their overall range. And they have 14% king high, 16% ace high, 9% nothing. A good chunk of hands here that just don't really have a lot, right? Now, we obviously also have a lot of ace high, but if you look at the top portion of our range, we have 7% overpairs. So already we have 7% of hands out there in our range that can play a reasonable sized pot, play a fairly big pot that villain can't have. And then we also have 1% two pair, we have 3% sets, and 1% straights. So the actual frequency of two pair plus is pretty much the same for both players. And that's because our range overall is tighter to begin with. We're opening from hijack, so we're opening about 25-ish% of hands when villain is defending with sort of 50 or 60%. So even though both players can have sets of similar frequency, or both players can have similar portions of the deck in terms of sets and also straights, the frequency that they have straights overall, just by virtue of having 9-8 off in their range and us not having it, all it does is it takes them from 1% to 2% in terms of the frequency that they have a straight. And then that's actually compensated by the fact that because they're three betting pocket tens like more than half the time pre-flop, they only have a set 1% of the time. So in a general sense, they just don't have that many good hands for us to be super scared of, right? They just aren't really that dense to strong stuff. And if you look at our overall strategy, we have a pretty good chunk of B75 here on this flop. And it's pretty reasonable to play a lot of these boards as B75 or check in a lot of spots. Now, if I was to compare this to the other board that I've brought up here, which is 9-7-6, there's actually a fairly substantial difference just between 10-7-6 and 9-7-6. You can see 10-7 has like a tiny shred of overbetting and a tiny shred of small betting, but 9-7 has a really clean check or B75 with no small betting and no big betting. And 9-7-6 actually also has a little bit of donking from the big blind. They have a B25 dot that they're using here that they were almost never using. There's like tiny shreds of it, not enough to actually register. It's less than 1% here that they're actually donking on the 10-7-6, but it's a good 9% or so on the 9-7-6. And that's because, first of all, even though it says overpair 0%, they do actually have pocket tens a tiny shred of the time here. So their overpair has gone from 0 to less than 1%. Now they have a straight 3% of the time. And two of those, 10-8 offsuit and 8-5 suited, are straights that we can never have. There's two different ways to make a straight here, which is quite important, both of which big blind can have. On the other board, there's only one way to make a straight. Here, they still have 1% sets, but they now have 2%, 3% two pairs. Because unlike the previous board where they didn't have 10-7 off in full and they never had 10-6 off at all, here they have 9-7 off in full, they have 7-6 off in full. So they don't have 9-6 off, but they do have 9-6 suited. They have all the suited two pairs, even though they're 3-betting 7-6 pre sometimes. In general, the density of two pair plus has gone up here from 5% to about 7%. And on top of that, if you look at the number of hands that just flop medium to good equity, they now have 46% straight draws compared to previously they had 38%, right? So they have lots of hands that have that straight draw equity. And if we look at our range, we actually have a pretty decent chunk of straight draws here too. 40% of the time we have a straight draw. We have 28% ace high here, 18% king high. So just the fact that so many more of our Broadway hands miss this board is going to make a big difference here. You can see that actually, if we look at the top pair region in particular, because we're opening every single Broadway here, on the 10-7-6, we have top pair 16% of the time. On 9-7-6, we only have it 8% of the time. So if we were opening from cutoff or button and we had all that offsuit 9x stuff in our range, king 9 off, 10-9 off, etc., that would change this board quite a bit. But because we don't have that offsuit top pair stuff anymore, it makes 9-7-6 quite a bit different to the 10-7-6. Does that make sense?
Yes. Because of for me to try to reiterate this.
Sure.
The way that the combos of them having 10-8 off, 8-5 suited that we don't have, give them just a little more straights. We connect more in the previous board with our top pairs, with those offsuit 10x that you mentioned that we don't have here. They have a lot more. I don't know about they have more. Would you say that they have more two pair?
Yeah, they certainly have more two pair than us. They have 3%, we have 1%. So it's another part of it. We don't really have much two pair one way or the other. In particular though, I think you can sum it up by pretty much saying that in a big picture sense, they go from 5% two pair plus to 7%, and we pretty much stay at 5%. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is they go from, where are we at? They go from 11% top pair to
11.
Yeah, they stay at 11% top pair, but we go from 16% top pair to only 8%. So our top pairs get cut in half. So we now have just so much of this offsuit Broadway stuff. If we thought about it in terms of combos, we have almost all these hands, or basically all these hands in pure here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's 144 combos of offsuit Broadways and ace highs that are going to be in very awkward spots across 3 streets on a board like this. So that's a big difference to the previous board, where on the previous board, actually, let's exclude ace 9 and ace 8 off here, because obviously those interact with this board to some degree. But on the previous board, the ace 9 and ace 8 have the straight draw, and then all of these 48 combos of ace 10 through jack 10 off, they all flop top pair. And that just makes it much more, it first of all makes it easier for us to have hands that want to play a big pot for value or decently sized pot for value. But it also just means that we have so many more hands in our range that can very easily and comfortably defend against any kind of donk bet from the big blind, which is why the donk bet doesn't really happen very much. But on this board, where we have all this offsuit Broadway stuff, this is the exact type of region that if villain does donk bet, which they're not doing a ton of the time, but if they do donk bet it, you can see we actually have a bunch of folds with all of this Broadway stuff that's offsuit and doesn't have a backdoor. So the presence of a lot of these offsuit missed hands in our range actually makes quite a big impact. And that's one of the reasons why in this particular formation, a 10 high connected board is going to be a bit different from a 9 high connected board. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
I see that they have 30% of pairs here where we have 13, 16. Is that a bit of a factor as well?
We're talking 30% of pairs. Where are we talking here?
I'm adding up top pair 11% plus second pair 10% plus third pair 11% on the left.
Oh yeah. So that is going to be partially a factor, but it's not going to be a driving factor, because a lot of those middle pair type hands are not necessarily hands that really are going to end up wanting to put a lot of money in to begin with. It's more going to be the fact that as far as the donk bet goes, part of it is going to be that because we don't have as many hands that can bet for value, if they don't donk bet, we're not going to put as much money in, which is partially why they start donk betting, because they do have 7% of the deck that wants to, or 7% of their range that wants to start growing the pot. So you want to think about it in those terms a lot, that when it comes to out of position betting or out of position donking, a lot of it is going to come down to how much betting is the in position player going to do versus a check. And if the answer is not very much, then the out of position player is going to start donking a lot more, because the top portion of their range is going to need to get money in somehow. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Cool. So that kind of covers that sort of differentiation between those two textures. What I want to do as a follow-up to what we talked about last time is to start thinking a little bit about how we're going to be building strategies for a lot of these turn scenarios that we might get in, right? Because we've talked about flop strategies so far. We've talked about how to use that sizing framework, but we haven't gone into how we're building turn strategies. So what I want to do to begin with is check in on a couple of spots in the trainer. And what I've done is I've used like a little Chrome add-on that lets me hide a part of my screen here to just cover up our hole cards. So I'm going to go through a couple of trainer spots, look into what sort of processes you're using and how you're picking sizes on turns, and then just look through a few examples and start to break down some simple heuristics for how we can pick turn sizings in a lot of cases, and then start to think a little bit about selecting bluffs and things like that. First of all, we got the same spot. We got hijack big blind, 60 big blinds. And I'm just going to pick a sizing for us here. We're going to bet the 3/4 pot size on the flop. Didn't give us a turn there, so we'll just proceed until it does. I'm going to go big bet on this flop too. Oh, it doesn't like big bet. Okay, so small bet. All right. So we small bet this flop, and it looks like whatever hand we have, it's a hand that wanted to pure small bet on this flop instead of mixing some large bets like our range does. So that's interesting. But let's just think about strategy wise. We small bet on king, queen, 5, 2 spades. We get called. Turn is a 5 and we face a check. What type of factors are you considering here when you're trying to pick what sort of bet sizing is going to make sense for your overall strategy here?
I would say at the top end of our range, where there's a lot of value we can get from flush draws, either from an inferior top pair or the middling pair like a queen. It is not the best at the 5 paired, but I don't think that should be overall driving our strategy. I still think the presence of Jack 10 offs, like all the Jack 10 offsuit, there's still a good amount of straight draws we can get value from.
Okay. So slow down for a sec there. The first thing that I think we want to be clear on is we want to start by looking at, anytime we're seeing another board card, we have to look at, did that card change the board? We have to look at, did the nuts change? Is there a change in the portion of range that wants to play a big pot now or wants to stack off? And I think the answer here, whenever the board pairs on the turn, has to be yes, because unless the board pairing card is just not in either player's range at any frequency, which is definitely not the case here, we always have to be mindful that a hand like aces, ace, king, whatever hand it is that we had on the flop that was part of our value range, it definitely just got weaker, because clearly our opponent can have a 5, right? They're defending every suited 5 in the deck, plus a bunch of offsuit 5s pre-flop. We bet small on flop, which means that they're never going to fold a 5. They're going to continue with a 5 every time. And even if they might occasionally raise it as a bluff sometimes, they're not going to fold it. So clearly they can have a 5. And that definitely reduces our capacity to just play big pots with certain types of hands. But it also doesn't necessarily mean that we're just going to tighten up completely and not put another chip in with anything that loses to a 5, right? We're not just going to suddenly auto check pocket aces, ace, king, all that sort of stuff. So we have to come to a compromise. We have to understand that we don't want to default into, I'm only going to value bet when I have a hand that I am very confident is basically the nuts. But we also don't want to default into, I'm just going to assume that my opponent doesn't have a 5 and just continue putting in a ton of chips with anything that kind of constitutes value. And the way that manifests itself in terms of how we build our actual strategy pretty much just amounts to, if this was a 4 or a 3 or a deuce that wasn't a spade, we would be betting really big here because our value range would want to be trying to get all in by the river. But when there is a 5 out there, we have to hedge a little bit. And the sizing that we're probably going to use more often is most likely going to veer a little bit towards the B75 region as opposed to the overbet that we have here at the bottom. Because now we have to worry about the possibility that we do get check raised sometimes. And we also have to continue using a size that at least makes it possible for us to get called by worse often enough to offset how often we run into better hands. And that's what it comes down to here. The more often we're going to run into better, the more we have to make sure we're still getting paid off by worse. So we actually have to size down, right? So generally speaking, we're not going to overbet that frequently when the turn changes the board to some degree like this. So I would be a little surprised to see the overbet get used at much of a frequency here. I would think that probably the most common size is going to be this B75 one. We don't know what hand we have, obviously. Okay, so as you can see, there is actually a little bit of overbetting here. There's not a lot of small betting, but the B75 is the dominant size. And I would imagine that probably what's happening is, we're seeing, let's see. Well, okay, turn. Yeah, okay. So this is actually pretty interesting, right? The reason why this spot looks the way it does is because this card is actually good enough for villain. That villain is supposed to donk bet this turn quite a bit. They're donking like almost half of their range here, right?
Wow.
This is what I mean by a 5 is definitely not a bad card for them. They have trips 12% of the time here, right? So we certainly have to be mindful of that. And in fact, the only thing that kind of makes it so that we can still do some fairly big betting here is the fact that if we were to look at what happens after they actually check, when they actually check, they now only have trips 9% of the time because a lot of their trips hands are leading out on the turn. So they have top pair more often than they have trips now. They have second pair a lot of the time. So once they actually check the turn, they have a little bit less in the way of trips. Now, if we were up against an opponent who was never donk betting this turn, for example, they're just never donk betting anything, now they would still have all of that 12% of trips. So we would probably be much more inclined not to go with any overbetting on the turn here and just go with the B75 size so that we can still value bet some strong kings and so on, but we're not putting an excessive amount of money in the pot. Now, if you look, it's worth noting here that even if we were using the 75% size, we look at our top pair region, like ace king is not a pure bet here, right? Even when we're not betting an overbet size, ace king suited, ace king offsuit, good amount of checking in there. King queen, because we block so much of the stuff we're actually trying to get value from, mixing all three. And then stuff like king jack with like a king with no kicker really. Kicker doesn't play because of the queen out there. Something like king jack is not really betting very often on the turn here. So there's a little bit of nuance there, but the bottom line is we actually have to be somewhat conservative with our turn bets. And by the same token, we can't really overbet very consistently there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the bottom card pairing isn't a brick. It changes the nuts. And then also we need to be more, we can't bet for as big of a size or with as much of our range if they don't donk their trips, if they check range to us.
Yeah. If they were to never donk anything here, we can't run that using Octopi, but I would imagine that we would probably see significantly less betting and probably no overbetting. We would probably just go B75 or check. In practice, I would just go B75 or check here. I would not overbet this in practice because I do think people are a little bit less inclined to donk on these turns than what they probably should be. So yeah, just a spot where we have to be quite mindful. That does actually change the board. Now here, I'm gonna try B75 here and see what it likes. Okay, so we just get a fold. That's fine. It's kind of interesting not knowing what our hand is. Okay, all right, so that's a good spot. So we got small on this A7 deuce, and then we get a 3 of spades turn, right? So first question is, does this turn card change the board? What's the answer?
Yes, complete.
Yes, absolutely it does. So now the fact that it changed the board means that it's unlikely to be a spot where either player really gets to just shovel a bunch of money in. Because if it changed the board in our favor in some way, then that would be the case. If it changed the board in villain's favor in some case, then obviously they would probably start putting a lot more money in. But this is a pretty neutral card because both players can have flushes. Now, because both players can have a lot of flushes here, if we were to pick an overbet size in this spot, that would probably make it really difficult for us to value bet anything that wasn't a flush, right? If we were just going to have an overbet or a check, overbetting on a flush card with something like a set or two pair is very dangerous and really difficult to get back, right? But at the same time, overbetting with a flush is also quite difficult because we block a lot of the stuff we're actually trying to get action from. If we have the nuts here, if we have king, queen of spades, what spade hands can villain have that they're going to actually call a big bet with on a 3-spade turn? So this again becomes another situation where it's quite natural that the majority of our bets here are not going to be overbets, not going to be particularly big. They're probably going to be in the territory of the 50 or the 75% again. And there might even be some small bets here. There might even be some small bets to allow us to value bet fairly thinly with an ace. So something like ace 10 of clubs or whatever might bet small here to just get a bit of extra value from a 7 or something like that. But I'm going to hit the B75. Don't know what hand we have, but yeah, okay. So you can see it's just 50 or 75, right? There's no overbetting at all. There's no small betting, in fact. So it looks like an ace can actually just bet the 50% size. Ace 10 does have some bets here. It's just not going very small, like ace 10 suited, kind of mixing the 50% size. But basically, you can really see here that there's no overbetting at all because the board changes on the turn. We have 6% flushes, but villain is clearly going to have good amount of flushes as well. They have 8% flushes. So even though they don't really get to donk the turn here, it is a spot where our ability to size up is pretty heavily restricted. You can see that not that much of our top pair is betting here. A pretty good chunk of those middle to weaker top pairs are pretty much never going to have any reason to bet. And so again, it just converges around a size that is not particularly big, right? So we're looking at these kinds of medium sizes here. And that's going to be pretty consistent across a lot of these flush completing turns. Now, this one's interesting because we get a monotone flop. So monotone flop, we pretty much know we're not going to bet big on. And you can see here, range bet, close to range bet on the flop with a small size. Now we get a queen of hearts turn. So let's talk through this type of situation, because on the one hand, this is not a turn card that changes the board, obviously. On the other hand, it's also the case that on a lot of monotone boards, a lot of strong hands, a lot of flushes will be inclined to slow play on the flop at a pretty high rate, right? So it's not necessarily inconceivable that we're still up against a flush, right? The board didn't change, but we're also in a situation where villain's range is probably not super capped just because they check called the flop, right? They still have flushes. They still have some strong hands. So this might actually converge to right around that kind of medium sizing again. I don't know for sure. Let me hit the B50 option. Let's see if it likes that. Okay, so it is, yeah, B50. So we're not going particularly big here. And this is partially because of what I mentioned there, where villain can still have some flushes. So if we look after check calling flop, villain still have 7% flushes, right? So 7% flush, 1% set, and then 7% two pair as well. So because they're just doing significantly less check raising on the flop overall, they're only check raising 11% of the time on the flop. They now have a pretty uncapped range. They're still pretty well protected here. And it's not easy for us to use any kind of big size. And if you look at the region of hands that we're value betting with, we're only betting the B50 size, but even something like aces with no spade is actually pure check, right? So we're actually pretty hesitant to bet again here with a hand like aces that would really hate to get check raised here. So that's a pretty noteworthy thing about these monotone boards. So generally speaking, monotone boards are to some extent the exception, where even if the turn doesn't change the board very much, we still can't easily go particularly big because we're usually up against a range that includes at least a few slow played flushes. Does that make sense?
And you would say that the slow played flushes is even in just the sim, not even in the live poker.
Right, exactly. In a live poker environment, if you think your opponent is slow playing even more than what the sim is going to do, then you have to be even more cautious going into the turn, especially if there are some other hands that potentially they are supposed to continue with, but they're actually folding. So yeah, you do have to be very mindful of that in practice. Now let's see if we can let's hit B25. Okay, so we actually get check raised here. This is interesting. We'll just talk about this a little bit briefly here. So this is a curious spot, but we get check raised on the flop, we call, and villain checks the turn. Now, on the turn here, when a deuce of spades comes off, obviously it did change the board. And naturally, that would quite often mean that we would go with some much more moderate sizes here. But it's also the case that we're facing a totally different line, right? We're in a line where villain check raised the flop and then check the turn. So we want to think about what some of the most common hands are that are going to do that. And in fact, a lot of the time, the type of range that we're going to see here is we're either going to see a hand like a medium to strong top pair, or we're going to see some pure give ups, some straight draws that missed or something and are just giving up. And we're also going to see a few traps in the form of some flushes. But as far as our betting range goes on this turn, it's going to be very different to what we just bet the flop and get called, because now hands that are, let's say, just one pair, like a strong one pair, they're probably going to have a lot less reason to try to get value now, right? We're probably going to have a lot more of a polar betting range here where we're pretty much betting flushes, maybe a couple of sets, and there really isn't much two pair in our range. So it's pretty much flushes and sets, and then bluffs that we're betting on the turn. So we might actually see a bit more of a sort of a 75-ish kind of size. Okay, so we're going a bit smaller than that. We're going 25 and 50. Okay, 30 and 50. So tiny bit of 75 coming in there. Basically, we're certainly not overbetting here, and we are going more in that moderate territory, it looks like. But part of it is because, as we can see, when villain checks the turn, if I highlight their checking range, oh, that didn't really work. Okay, there's a bug that we're still fixing about highlighting the checking range there on the turn. But if you look at the categories, the top pair region is checking a bit more often. The under pair region, the nothing region, the second pair region, those are the types of hands that they're going to have a lot of the time here. And the flushes, they're actually heavily favoring betting, right? The flushes are not checking very much on the turn. So it's mostly that we're betting that kind of a size on the turn here because the SPR is pretty low. It's not so much the case that we're actually particularly concerned about running into strong stuff. You can see that if we bet the 50% size, we only get check raised on the turn here 10% of the time. The double check raise obviously doesn't come in very often. And even if they do pretty much never fold top pair here, they have enough other stuff. A lot of these like weakish flush draws that got there on the turn with one spade. Some of that stuff is now in a very awkward spot against that B50 size. So we're coming down a little bit from the B75, but we're still able to bet this turn at a pretty decent frequency there. Now I want to try to find, just fold. I want to try to find at least one spot where the turn is a brick. We're going to bet big here, medium size, and it actually should have been even bigger than that. At least 9-3, but small. And he just folds. You know what? We don't need to use trainer for this because I loaded up a bunch of spots already. So I'm going to look over here at this spot that I preloaded, which is King 8 Deuce Rainbow. So this is just your standard range bet board. We're just going to bet smaller here every time. Very trivial, very straightforward. We get called. And then if we focus in on the overall distribution of the strategy here, we're not going to worry too much about individual hands yet. If we focus in on the strategy on the turn by hitting the show runouts tab in just a moment, we go right here. It's going to give us an overall sense of what we're doing on turns, right? And because of the nature of this board, you can see that our strategy is really consistent across a lot of turn cards, right? There's not really a lot of change whatsoever. It's King 8 Deuce on the flop. And because it's such a blank flop, most turn cards are going to produce pretty much the same effect as far as they're not really going to change the range very much, right? There's a little bit of alteration on queen or an ace, but for the most part, the vast majority of turns are not really going to affect the board. So we have this very nice, clean kind of strategy here as far as sizing selection. But where it gets quite interesting is when we're thinking about what specific hands are going to do. And I think this is going to give us, or this usually gives quite a lot of insight when you look at things in this way, right? So if we look at a portion of our flop value range, so if we look at like pocket eights, right? Pocket eights, as you can see, very clear, just overbet every turn, right? Just like, other than when you make a full house where you can actually bet a bit smaller, it's just a very clear, we have a set, we want to get money in, it's pretty easy, pretty trivial, right? So that one doesn't require too much thought. We have something like ace king of diamonds, ace king diamonds. We have, once again, reasonably straightforward, right? An 8 we're a little bit scared on because villain makes a lot of trips there, but you can see very clear progression here to where we have a pretty trivial value there. Now, what do you think if I put in something like, if I give us like king 7 of diamonds here, what do we think where our average turn strategy with a hand like that is going to look like here?
It's a good question.
How many turn cards are we going to be able to bet again on with king 7 of diamonds?
On king 8 deuces 1 diamond, I'd say any of the diamonds, a 7.
Okay.
Yeah, those are the ones that immediately come to.
Okay. So take a look at this. We are sometimes betting on a diamond, but it's not mandatory, right? We're over betting on a 7. And we're occasionally using some of the smaller to more moderate sizes on a diamond. But for the most part, a lot of these brick cards, yeah, we're just checking. If you have a medium top pair like this, turns a brick, you still have a pretty good hand. You're going to have a pretty good hand on almost every single river. Quite hard to get much value by betting again because you would need to get called by an 8 often enough to offset the fact that you sometimes just run into a better king. And in the end, it comes down to you just don't really have too much reason to bet on most turn cards. Now, if we looked at something that is in that region of middle pocket pairs, perhaps, if we look at, let's say, pocket 10s, that hand is going to be almost the same, right? We're basically just, for the most part, just checking the turn. There's a couple of specific spots where we get to bet again, like some of the turn cards that bring like pair plus flush draw stuff where we can eke out some thin value, we can bet again. But largely, we're just doing a ton of checking when we have second pair here as well. So the majority of our value and our sort of medium strength hands are relatively straightforward there. What's not straightforward is what we do with some of our bluff candidates, because if we're range betting the flop, we have a lot of bluff candidates in our range. Tell me an example here of a hand where you feel like if you bet the turn, if you bet the flop and you get called, you don't really know what type of turn strategy is going to make sense for certain combos.
Pocket fours.
Pocket fours. All right, let's take a look at pocket fours then.
Feels like it would be something makes me think this would be where maybe we pull some bluffs.
Nope. Take a look at that. Just check. And what it comes down to is we have plenty of showdown value. Now you have a pretty decent hand. Like you have plenty of showdown value. You just don't need to bluff because you win so often on so many turn cards. The only turn card where your hand gets substantially worse is on an ace. And that's because all of the ace high hands that check called the flop just got better, right? Now, if we looked at ace high, if we look at something like ace jack of diamonds, for example, which is a pretty strong ace high. Sorry, go ahead.
If the ace was good for them, how come it looked like the solver was having us bet the ace a lot?
Oh, so what's happening there is we're just bluffing. That's what it is. Okay. It's like our hand doesn't have much showdown value anymore. So it becomes a potentially viable bluff. So we're not value betting on that turn by any means. What it is that the idea of we don't need to bluff because we have enough showdown value to win without it is no longer valid when we have significantly less showdown value. And on top of that, when we bluff on an ace, there's a lot more 8x and other pocket pair hands that are going to fold than there would be on other cards, right? So it's another part of it. And take a look at ace jack, right? Even ace jack doesn't really need to bluff except for sometimes on a queen or a 10 when we pick up a bit of equity. But even then, not mandatory by any means, just a lot of fairly simple checking back. But now let's pick another hand, but pick a weaker hand. Pick a hand that's like queen high or worse.
Queen 10 of hearts, maybe?
Queen 10 of hearts, okay. All right. This is where it gets a lot more ambiguous, right? Because now we have to really start considering potential bluffs. We have to really start thinking about which turn cards we're going to check, which turn cards we're going to bet. And you can quite clearly see that the ones that are checking almost always is when we actually turn a pair, right? So that's pretty straightforward. And where it gets complicated is when we don't turn any equity. Now, if I was to look at, let's say, the most frequent overbet cards, when we turn jack, makes sense that an overbet would work well there because we turn an open ender. A heart, a lot of the heart hands are pretty good for that. And then we've also got an ace in there too, but also a 3 or 4 of spades, like a complete brick 3 or 4 of spades. So this is where we start to get into the territory of certain hands just need to function as bluffs because otherwise we can't find enough bluffs, right? On a turn 3 or 4 here, if we don't bluff with some stuff like queen 10 of hearts, we can't find enough bluffs to incentivize our opponent to actually continue at the rate that we need them to. And the same is true for if we look at the very bottom of our range here. If we look at something like 5-4 of hearts, right? 5-4 of hearts, it's probably actually going to barrel a turn quite a bit here. Yeah, there you go. So there's clearly some turn cards that we check, right? You can see turn of 5, turn of 4, we're checking that. Turn an ace, actually checking that, which is quite interesting because I think that turning a straight draw there, maybe we have some incentive to realize that equity. It's interesting. We're betting a bit on a 6 or a 7. So even when we turn the low straight draw, there's limited incentive to bet. But in fact, the cards that we like bluffing on the best are some of the cards that are just absolute air cards for us. Like we're doing a lot of bluffing on like a queen, a jack, a 10, that sort of thing. And it just comes down to, we need to have enough bluffs on those cards, right? We need to aggressively find bluffs because these are cards where we have plenty of hands that have equity to bluff with, but that's not enough in most cases. It's not enough to just bluff when you have equity and not bluff when you don't. So it's completely reasonable to take some parts of the very, very bottom of our range and be very willing to bluff on a lot of turn cards there as well. And then the final thing is if we look at something like ace-4 of hearts, that hand has a pretty decent incentive to bluff as well. And this is a complete contrast from what we saw with, say, ace-jack of diamonds, right? What's the biggest difference between ace-jack and ace-4 that might encourage ace-4 to bluff more, even though ace-jack is not?
I remember this from us working together in the past. When we have ace-4, we can get ace-5 to fold, ace-6, ace-7.
Exactly right. Yep, absolutely. So that's exactly what's happening here, right? Villain is going to float the flop or call the flop with a lot of ace-highs. When we barrel ace-jack on the turn and ace-9 or ace-7 or something folds, that's bad. When we barrel ace-4 and those hands fold, that's good. So these high card, low card type hands, those are very good turn barrels here in a lot of cases. Even if we looked at something like queen 6 suited, which is probably like the bottom of our suited queen range here. Yeah, okay, so that hand is not really overbetting the turn very much. That's interesting. But it is willing to barrel for some of these smaller sizes quite often. That's interesting. Not exactly sure what might create that. I'd have to look into the sims a little bit deeper, but it looks like queen 6 is specifically preferring to bluff for the smaller sizes, which is a little weird. But you can see where some of the trends are going here, right? And you can clearly see that because most turn cards are complete bricks here, we need to pretty aggressively find bluffs on those bricks because we did range bet our entire range on the flop. So we have plenty of hands that still need to follow up in that spot. Now, another category of situation that it's important to understand the mechanics of is paired boards, because paired boards, naturally, they're going to be boards that we bet the flop with quite a lot, but they're also going to be boards where, because it's a bit more natural, it's a bit less natural for there to be a lot of draws on these boards, there's going to be a lot of turn cards where we don't have a ton of super obvious bluffs that we're going to be able to identify. And this is going to flesh out for us a little bit of some of the principles that we're going to keep in mind in some of these spots. Now, you can see we are willing to do some overbetting here, and that's because villain is check raising a lot of 9x, and that's fine. But the bluffing region that we're using, if I was to just highlight it down here, just highlight everything that's at the bottom end of this range, we can see a couple of things, right? You can see that immediately we're favoring hands that are worse than king 10. Let's say king 10 is a hand that is pretty much strong enough to have a decent chunk of showdown value here on this deuce turn. We're doing a lot of bluffing with queen jack, queen 10, jack 10, etc., offsuit and so on. The reason for the offsuit hands doing more bluffing than the suited ones is there's a lot of very specific things that happen sometimes here as far as unblockers and unblockers, but really the offsuit hands are blocking two combos of suited hands, whereas the suited hands, they're blocking multiple, but the offsuit combos are blocking more suited hands than the suited combos are. So that's kind of part of what's contributing here. So when you do see differences between offsuit and suited hands like this, it's going to be related to bluffers there. But in particular, you can see that we're favoring bluffing this turn with something like an overcard that has an 8, right? Like an overcard with an 8 is pretty good. Overcard with a 7 is nice as well. 2 undercards, not really ideal. Overcard plus a 6, 5, or 4, not as ideal as well. And a lot of it comes down to, if we focus on the overbet, we want to isolate what type of hands our opponent is actually folding. And this is a really important concept for looking at turn strategies and how we're actually building them is you want to think about, because the ranges are starting to narrow, you want to think about what's the specific region of hands our opponent is most likely going to have when they check fold the turn. And you want to make sure that your region of hands that you're going to be bluffing with is unblocking that stuff as much as possible, right? So in this case, if we highlight specifically the folding region, we can actually do that. It's going to cooperate. That's nice. You can see that 45% of the time when they fold the turn, they have ace high, right? So clearly bluffing with a hand that blocks ace high is going to work less well, which is part of why we don't bluff with ace high on the turn here that often. Similarly, they also have 24% king high, and that's why hands like king 10 don't bluff here. King 10, king jack, king queen, they don't bluff because they don't want king 8 and below to fold, right? But everything king 8 and below can bluff at least at some frequency because it benefits from getting king 10 plus to fold. And then we've got the queen high with the lower kicker and so on. And part of why the 8 is actually functioning slightly better here is all to do with the fact that if you look at the specific combos of each of these hands, these queen highs, jack highs, 10 highs, etc., that are existing in the range right now. In fact, maybe if I make it 2D, it might make it easier to see. Yeah, you can see it here. If I highlight it using this. So if you look at the queen 8, jack 8, 10 8, those are very low frequency here because they were doing a lot of flop check raising, right? These hands that wrap around the 9, they were check raising the flop a lot. 8-7 is not in there very much. 8-7 off, not in there very much. So when we have an 8 in our hand, we're unblocking as much of that other folding stuff as we possibly can be, right? And that's why the 8 is a little bit better for us to bluff with than the 7. So it's just a really micro level functionality here as far as our overall range goes. But it is something that does matter quite a bit. And if we were to look at our overall strategy for some other turn cards, I would imagine, oops, that's the wrong note. I would imagine we might see that some of these 8x hands are actually more prone to bluffing on some of the other runouts as well here. This is actually a little bit easier way to see this.
So when you say, I'm just trying to wrap my head around that last point. When you say with our hands that have the 8, we're unblocking their...
We're unblocking their folds. We're unblocking as much of the folding range as possible. And it's because the hands that they have that are check calling the flop are mostly hands that don't have an 8 in them. They are actually check raising a lot of their 8x hands on the flop. So it's a complex example of the dynamic here, but the general heuristic that we're looking at is you want to ensure that outside of the hands that are barreling the turn because they have equity and so on, you want to ensure that your turn barrel hands are unblocking as many folds as possible. And you'll see that if we look at a couple other situations as well. If I look at something like that's not what I meant. I didn't want to choose the turn card. I want to choose our hand. Go back. Yeah. In fact, let me just show you the flop check raise quickly because that'll hopefully flesh it out in a bit more detail. Look at if I highlight the nothing region. Yeah. So this kind of shows it pretty clearly, right? Look, this area here, look how much check raising is happening, right?
A lot.
8-7, all of that stuff, right? And this is why we love having an 8 or 7 in our hand to bluff the turn with. It's because a lot of the 8x and 7x hands in their range, they were check raising the flop with. So we're not blocking that much of their folding range on the turn when we have an 8 or a 7 in our hand. But when we have some other card in our hand, a 10, a 4, whatever it is, we are actually blocking a little bit more of their folding range. I can probably illustrate it here. If I go to the turn, oops, let's get rid of that. If I go to the turn here, and then I go blockers and more right here, and then we look at what villain's doing on this 4 turn. Oh, we were looking at the deuce before working, so let me see the spades right there. We can use the card matching function right here. 125, card matching. So when they have the 8 of diamonds in their hand, they fold the turn 8% more often, right? So when we have the 8 of diamonds in our hand, you see what the effect is that's happening here? We're maximizing the frequency that they can be folding, right? If instead of putting the 8 of diamonds in the card matching tab, we've put it in the blockers tab, it stays the same, right? That's what we want. We want to, it's not so much that we are actively blocking anything, it's that we want to avoid this spot where they have the 8 of diamonds in their hand and then they're folding more often, right? So that's the tricky part about it. But that's the main thing here is you don't want to have cards that overlap with the hands that they are going to be folding. And that's why, as you can see, on this particular turn, a lot of our barrel range is a lot of this 9x, 8x, 7x type stuff. And if we go ahead.
They wouldn't, and they are not folding the 8.
They are folding the 8 of diamonds on the turn. Most of the hands that have the 8 of diamonds on the turn here are folding. So we don't want them to have the 8 of diamonds. So we want ourselves to have the 8 of diamonds. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I thought we're bluffing though. We want them to fold.
Which is why we don't want to have, okay, so let me back it up a little bit and let me try to clarify this, right? When we're bluffing the turn, we want to maximize the frequency that they fold. When they have the 8 of diamonds, the frequency that they fold is going up. When they have something other than the 8 of diamonds, the frequency that they fold is going down. Okay. So the only way that we can guarantee that they don't have the 8 of diamonds is if we have it ourselves.
Okay. Yeah.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
And now by having the 8 of diamonds ourselves, we guarantee that we are not in a position where they are more likely to be, they're less likely to be folding the turn. And we're more likely to be in a position where they're folding the turn because we're opening up more of the hands they're going to fold. Another good way to look at it is in the inverse, right? If we look at the hands that they are folding the turn with, the 8 is not as important here. What's important is if you look at the stuff that they are folding, it's predominantly, where was it? It was predominantly ace high and king high, right? This is about as much as we need to really remember, which is that most of the time when they're folding the turn, they have ace high or king high. Therefore, bluffing with ace high or king high from our perspective is less good. And then to go down, to take that same concept and go down to a really micro level, that's where we start looking at, we prefer to have an 8 that have a 4 and so on. But generally speaking, we just want to have hands that are unblocking as much ace high and king high as possible. That's the main sort of a takeaway here. So if we go back to the runouts and we look at, so the general kind of perspective here, if we sort it by check-in frequency, you can see fairly similarly to what we saw before. We've got a certain amount of kind of medium betting on the turn, not that much over betting, but there is some. I think the general reasoning here behind not that much overbetting occurring is similar to that monotone board that we saw earlier, where when the board is monotone, villain will occasionally slow play flushes. When the board is paired like this, they're also going to slow play some trips from time to time. And if you look here at what they have on the turn, they do have trips 5% of the time, right? So if they were check raising every single trips on the flop, we would be able to bet a lot bigger on the turn on average. But because they're sometimes trapping it, we don't get to bet quite as big. So that's a pretty general kind of a concept there, but it does obviously match up pretty well with a lot of what we might be familiar with from the other spots. Now, if I look at a different type of a board texture, one like this, 9-8 deuce, 2 clubs, where we're going to bet a little bit bigger on the flop here, going to bet maybe more of a B75 kind of a size. When they check call, they don't have as much of the ace high and the king high, right? Their ace high and king high is heavily favoring folding on the flop because we bet a lot bigger. In fact, they're actually folding third pair about half the time now, right? They're folding a deuce quite often. So that's going to slightly alter the range that we're up against, and it will affect the turn a little bit. But what you'll also see is that because the SPR is fairly low, and because they have a pretty decent incentive to check raise a lot of their strong stuff on the flop, there is going to be a certain amount of simplicity to what we can do on the turn here. You can see we have some overbetting and some big betting. It's like neither of these sizes is really the perfect size. It looks like the overbet is slightly too big and the B75 is slightly too small. So pot would probably be good here. But in general, I think we'll probably see here a little bit more of a distinction. Yeah, okay, so this is what I wanted to see. Good. So we've got some turn cards that are fairly distinct overbet cards, right? Or big bet cards, at least here. We've got some which are very clear overbet, and then generally everything that is like a 6 or lower that is not a club is pretty much a big bet card. Even a king that's not a club is a big bet card. It's 75 instead of the overbet. A 9, a medium-ish to big bet card. A 6 that is a club, a medium bet card. And then we've got very much going towards the other end of the spectrum here, right? If we look at the B75, an ace, a king, a 7 is in there, a 9 is in there. But clearly, we can't see very many clubs coming in here, right? You can't see very much of the flush draw type stuff that is arriving in here. And it takes until we get down to the B50 or even some of the B25, the B30 here, before we start to see a lot of these draw completing cards. You can see on a queen or a jack, when the straight draw gets there, but the flush draw doesn't, we've got B50 being used. When the flush draw gets there and the straight draw gets there, like a 6 or a 5 of clubs, again, moderating our frequency quite a lot. And then if we look at like a high card club, basically any royal flush club here, queen through ace, we're actually betting quite small. And this is going to be because we actually now have a bit of top pair that sort of wants to get an extra street of value if it can. We have a lot of those Broadway top pairs potentially. So there's a much broader set of sizings that are used now, right? So when we bet small on the flop, there's going to be quite a lot of the medium size to large size. There's going to be a lot more brick turn cards that are going to be nice, easy, clean overbet strategies. But then when we use the bigger size on the flop, we're going to see a wide variation of strategies that can be viable on the turn, because our opponent is much more restricted to specifically one pair when they check call a big bet on the flop. You see what I mean by that?
Yeah, they would most likely be raising their strong value.
Yeah, they're raising a lot of their strong value. They're also raising some draws as well. And in particular, they're also folding a lot of their weak stuff. So they're folding hands that would call if they face the small bet. So they have that region of ace highs, king highs, backdoors, whatever, that now folds, which means that the overall density of one pair in their range is quite high. If we look at on this particular flop, what frequency do they have one pair after they call here? Let's see if we can highlight that. Yeah, okay. So after they call, they have 22% top pair, 26% second pair, 11% third pair. So that is 48, that's 59% one pair when they check call this board. And that's obviously a ton. That's a lot of one pair hands. And what that means is that our strategy on the turn is going to heavily vary based on, is this turn card a brick, in which case all of that one pair stuff is now basically just bluff catching? Or did the turn card create a scenario where some of the draws got there, and so a lot of their one pair is now really weak, but the other stuff in their range now became stronger, right? So this is why you've got this really big disparity in strategies when you start to see the bigger bet come in on the flop. And so the lines that I think are the most valuable to study or to really get a handle on, you want to have a good understanding, obviously, of the small bet line where then you bluff turns or you're betting medium to large sizes on turns, overbet sizes. But the heuristics there, as far as what sizes we pick, how we choose our value betting range, and so on, those are usually relatively simple because a lot of the range bet boards coincide with a lot of the board textures where the turn card isn't really going to dramatically change the board very much. But here, when we bet larger on the flop, we got a lot of situations where the turn card will drastically alter the board. And you're going to have some turn cards that complete straights and flushes, some that complete only straights, some that complete only flushes, and some that complete nothing. And you've got a whole variation of strategies you can employ there. The other ones that I wanted to look at here are specifically a board like this, where it's a very static board texture, but it is an overbet board. So like an ace, king, 3, because we're overbetting because we have such a massive nut advantage here. This is a little bit of an exception because when we're actually overbetting as opposed to just going, say, B75 or something, their calling range is so condensed to one pair that there's not really even very many draws in their range at all here. Like after they call the flop here, let's see, when they call the flop here, they have 39% top pair and 31% second pair and 6% third pair. So they have 76% one pair now. And there's almost no draws that are even present on this board other than that straight draw. And even that, they're actually folding sometimes against that overbet on the flop. So now on the turn, probably going to see a fair amount of uniformity because we're back to that territory where it doesn't even really matter that much what the turn is here. And the SPR is really low as well. The SPR is only 2.3 here. Yeah. So you can see there's a ton of uniformity here, right? We're only really using the B75 and a little bit of B50, and that's about it. And it's because of that SPR being really low. We can still easily set up for a river shove using the B75. So when we do overbet the flop, again, a lot of uniformity on the turn, not a lot of like weird mixing or anything like that, right? That's pretty straightforward. And then finally, we've got a board like this where maybe it's a board where we are betting big on the flop with quite a lot of our range. We've got a pretty big chunk of hands that can bet big here on this triple Broadway. And obviously we get a ton of folds when we do bet that size. But if we get called and then we face the turn here, we'll probably see, since this board is rainbow, it's probably going to be a fairly big divergence between cards that complete that Broadway and everything else. Let's see. So the SPR is still 3.5. Yeah, okay. That's pretty much what I expected to see here. So we've got B75, by far the most common here. Basically everything that isn't a Broadway card, right? It's like B75 or check, right? Very simple. And even some of the Broadway cards that pair the board are B75 or check. But then the stuff that isn't, the stuff that's a queen or a 10 that completes the straight, we're sizing way down. We're not betting big on these turn cards. And that's because one way or another, we're going to be betting into a turn range that contains a good chunk of combos that are just a straight. And so there's very limited incentive for us to put large amounts of money in the pot with anything that isn't a straight on that kind of a turn card. So these 3 to a straight flops, when the straight does get there, you have to be quite mindful of that. The only other thing that I haven't looked at yet, which I almost forgot about, is let's look at a monotone flop, just real quick. This one, as we said before, these are generally going to be board textures where we're only going to bet small on flops, not really going to be doing any significant amount of large betting on flops here. This one's a pretty good one. We are betting pretty much range. We aren't getting check raise very much, which does affect things a fair amount. And on turn, most likely a good chunk of turns are bricks here, but not all of them. We are up against the flush 6 or 7% of the time, I think. And then if we look at the runouts, it's going to be some interesting stuff. Yeah. Okay. So the runouts, there's a fair amount of commonality here, but if we sort it by suit and then by rank, you can see what's going on. Anything that's not a spade, you can see there's a pretty distinct trend of if it's a low card, we're B75 or check. And then as the card gets higher, we're going a bit smaller because we have some more of that top pair type stuff, right? That wants to get a bit of value. And then if it's a spade, we have this really interesting strategy of some small bets and some over bets and nothing in the middle, right? And this is where these strategies get really tricky to execute and a little bit confusing sometimes. So let's just take a quick look at the deuce of spades here. And some of it is going to have to do with the fact that we have 2 very distinct regions of hands that might want to get value here. It's going to be the very strong flushes, and then it's going to be some stuff that loses to a flush. So like we have a flush 33% of the time here. And if we look at what the flushes are doing, it's literally only the nut flush and not even any of the king high flush. So it's literally only the nut flush that is betting the overbet size. So the big size is for specifically nut flush or a bluff. And that's because when we have the nut flush, we know by nature villain, we have the nuts, and villain also has all of the stuff that is worse that can call. So we do have a size specifically for the nut flush there. And then the size that goes with the smaller size is basically a lot of other flushes. If we look at other value here, set, 2 pair, over pair. Actually, let's highlight the flushes too. You can see that the flushes there's a lot of like king high flush, queen high flush, bet small. Even like a 9 high flush can bet small for value. Pocket 10s can actually bet small for value. And that's interesting because it's a merge sort of thing here where we can actually bet big and get a small flush to fold and then have outs against the nut flush. And we have a set there, but that's a weird one. You don't really need to worry too much about that. But generally you can see we have 2 very distinct ranges, and this is going to be true on a lot of turn cards here. You have a range for the nut flush, and then you have a range for other value bets that might go so far as to include, you can see some overpairs here, betting small and trying to get a little bit of value. But if you focus on what the defending range is for villain here, it's going to look pretty odd. There's a lot of stuff that is quite counterintuitive here. They're never supposed to fold top pair here, or at least almost never. So that's pretty clear as to why we're still able to bet those overpairs. And then second pair, they are obviously folding it quite a bit. And they're also folding third pair, obviously quite a lot. But there's a lot of weird and non-intuitive kind of card removal stuff going on. And then you've also got the fact that they have almost no check raising as well. So they have a lot of weird sort of two street slow plays with certain things. Like they're just like check calling the nut flush pretty frequently. And it's going to produce some very odd river scenarios, but we don't have to go into that too much yet. It's just noteworthy to recognize that on a four flush turn here, we have a big size and then we have a small size, and it's really nut flush. And then everything else that isn't the nut flush, we take it from that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. All right. That's a bit of a crash course to picking turn sizings, and hopefully we can continue diving into some of this stuff. But I think for the next session, I think I had it down that we would look at some ICM concepts and just do a bit of a refresher on that. Make sure that your ideas are in the right sort of territory and that you're applying them in the right way. So we can crack on with that next week. And I think we should be in good shape to round things out after that one, at least with the final session after that one.
Okay. All right.
Cool.
Sounds great.
Excellent. No worries. I'll talk to you next week then.